All right, welcome to week one. This is our rhetoric and writing lecture. So each week we're going to have an overview, and week one will probably be the longest overview because we have a lot of things to talk about, just housekeeping stuff. And then I'll try to do a short lecture. Like I said, I'm trying to keep these to about 10 minutes or less for reading and one for rhetoric and writing. Feel free to watch these at your leisure, and if you need to watch them again, and as always, if you have any questions, send me an email. But let's get started with our rhetoric and writing lecture for this week. So first of all, the class is called Rhetoric 1, right? What does that even mean? What is rhetoric? And there's lots and lots of ways to define rhetoric, but I want to just start off by asking you to think about this just a little bit. Um, and by asking you, is rhetoric some of these things or all of these things or none of these things that I've got listed here on the slide? And of course, at any time, if you're watching, if you want to pause the video, I'm going to go through fairly quickly, but you could always, pause and just think about this for a minute. Politicians manipulating people. Is that rhetoric? We see that a lot, maybe we think, or just trying to persuade someone. For example, a friend of mine, when I was very young, trying to, out of high school, I didn't really think I was going to go to college. And I remember a friend trying to persuade me of that. Was that rhetoric? Is that rhetoric when politicians try to persuade or manipulate people? You're in a store and a salesperson wants you to buy something. You don't really need it, but you kind of want to buy it. Are they using rhetoric in that instance? A doctor, I had this experience a couple of years ago. My doctor was really trying to get me to eat healthier. And so that doctor urging me, was he using rhetoric? Or maybe you have to change your schedule at work. Maybe it has to do with school or a personal matter, and you're trying to explain that to your supervisor. Would you be using rhetoric? So think about that for a minute. We've got four or five things here, five things here, and there's probably lots more I could list. But what do you think? Are these examples of rhetoric? Well, think about that for a minute. And again, I won't slow down too much because you could pause this if you want to consider it. But if not, yeah, they are. All of them. Whatever you chose, if you said one or two or all of them, you're correct. All of the above examples might rely on rhetoric. It depends on how the person approaches it, because rhetoric, my definition, and our textbook that we're using for the class currently, the Harbrace Essentials book, would define rhetoric as the purposeful and the effective use of language. So if you're using language with a purpose and you're doing it in an effective, good way that makes sense to someone else and persuades them or whatever, you're using rhetoric. So rhetoric is valueless, is what I would say, in a way. And that may sound strange, but what I mean is it's not really a good thing or a bad thing, I don't think, in my opinion. It's neutral. It's like a pitchfork or a shovel. A shovel doesn't really have a value, but you could use a shovel to plant a tree, or you could use a shovel to hit somebody over the head, right? And that's kind of how rhetoric is. It's a tool, and if you use it effectively, you're using rhetoric. If you use language effectively. So if I'm confusing you, I'm not using language effectively. So that would be probably poor rhetoric. But if you're understanding me, you're following me, then maybe I'm using language effectively and I'm using rhetoric well. So the reason I have a picture of myself, that's a statue. It's hard to see me behind there maybe, but this is last winter I was able to go to Washington, D.C., and that's I am a rhetoric nerd, so I went, of course, on a pilgrimage to D.C. where all these famous politicians have spoken, and that's Abraham Lincoln, who, as you know, is from Illinois, and sitting behind me on that statue at the Lincoln Memorial. And on each side of him, there's two of his famous speeches, and one of those is the Gettysburg Address. So for rhetoric nerds, I think the Lincoln Memorial is like a kind of like a mecca. You kind of want to go there because there have been so many other great speeches. Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech was given on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So it's a place that I wanted to go, and I use that to introduce the next couple things we're going to talk about really quickly. Just a little bit about what's called the rhetorical situation. And I'm not going to dwell on this too much to keep the video fairly brief, but I want to say a little bit about it. Two things. So one is, when you're reading something, you can think about these colored things. If you see on the left side, opportunity, writer, audience, these words that are in color. And also, as a writer, you want to think about these, of course. So the first one, again, here we have our definition. Rhetoric is the purposeful and effective use of language. And we're going to talk just a little bit about something called the Gettysburg Address. It's a very famous speech, and where the picture you saw me on the previous slide there, the part of the Gettysburg Address, I believe, is one of the speeches. I think it's his inaugural. I believe that's the one on the right. Anyway, it's there. So it's a very famous speech, And it was given by Abraham Lincoln while he was president during the Civil War to dedicate a soldiers' national cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. That was on November 19th, 1863. So, what opportunity did he have? Well, you might think opportunity. Maybe that's too positive a sounding word. He had a lot of problems, right? The country was coming apart. We were in the middle of a civil war, which if the South had won, we would be two separate countries. So that was a big problem. And so he had this opportunity or problem or task. We could call a lot of things. You're going to have an essay assignment, and that essay assignment will be giving you a problem or a task or something that you have to do. So the first thing in the rhetorical situation, in other words, when you're getting ready to use rhetoric, hopefully to use language effectively, you want to think about what's my task. And of course, the first thing you can do in a college class, whatever class, if you have a writing assignment, is read the assignment, try to understand it as well as you can. And if you don't understand it, maybe ask your instructor, what did you mean when you said, and try to get more clarification. So you have an opportunity as a writer. Abraham Lincoln, when he was giving the Gettysburg Address, had an opportunity or a task or a problem. We know a lot about Abraham Lincoln as a writer. This is a little different when you're the writer. You have to kind of think about yourself and you have to think about your own values. So if I give you a topic, you have to really kind of reflect and say, well, how do I feel about that? And so one of the things we'll do a lot of times to find out more about ourselves as writers is do something that I call pre-writing. Not only me, lots of people call it pre-writing because it's what we do before we actually start writing. And we'll talk about that as we get more into the semester and talking about the writing process. You also, of course, want to think about your audience. Who was Abraham Lincoln speaking to when he gave the Gettysburg Address? Who are you writing to? Your audience in our class is pretty simple. I'm going to be reading your papers, and then a few of the students in the class, whoever you work with, and peer response groups will be reading your papers. So you have the audience that you want to think about. And if you don't know them, you kind of have to try to guess, right? That's one of the problems with doing public speaking. If you're speaking to 500 people, you don't really know everybody in the audience. If you're writing for even 5 or 6 people in our class, you might not know everybody. So you have to try to guess sometimes about your audience. But the more you know or you can imagine about your audience, usually the better. Abraham Lincoln had to think, there's probably some people in this crowd that I'm speaking to, people who are going to read this speech in the newspapers later, who maybe are wondering, why are we in this war? What are we doing? Shouldn't we just let the South maybe leave the Union and have 2 countries? People were probably asking those questions, right? So he knew his audience had a lot of questions. He could imagine that, even if he hadn't spoken to those exact people before the speech. We also are going to think, when we're giving a speech, we're going to think about our purpose. Are we trying to entertain somebody? Is this supposed to be a humorous speech? Are we trying to inform, just pass along some information, describe, argue? We're going to talk a lot about argument later on in the semester. So that's obviously going to be, in an essay writing class, a lot of times we are arguing. In other words, I have an opinion and I want you to maybe think about that opinion or even potentially agree with it. Do we have a message we're trying to deliver? That's often in an essay done in what's called a thesis statement, which we'll be talking about that more also as we go through the semester. And then a stance, that's also part of your thesis, right? You have a message or stance. What opinion or thesis do you state? So at some point, you really want to deliver that. And I'm sorry, this is really messages is partly your thesis, but it's also, I kind of miss this part, the support. So you deliver the message and you support it. And then finally, context. Abraham Lincoln was giving this speech in a very, very fractured, kind of difficult context, the social context of the American Civil War. So, if you're writing an essay about healthcare and should people have access to healthcare, let's say, you kind of have to think about our current context. Lots of developed countries in the world have healthcare and some don't, and so you have to really kind of be aware of that. So context can be really important, especially when you're writing an argumentative essay. If you want to click on this later and watch it, it's just a really good reading of the Gettysburg Address, which I doubt many people are going to want to watch that, but it's a guy named Jeff Daniels who's a really good actor, and it's from Michigan, I think, originally. And but anyway, that's what that link is. So you don't have to watch that, but I just put that there, and I won't do it here in the video. But this is the Gettysburg Address. You might have heard this before. It starts out 7 years ago. If you want to figure out how long ago that was, you have to look up why did people say 7 years ago. But it was a different way of talking about time. But a long time ago, the fathers brought forth this new nation. So he starts out by introducing, which we're going to talk about, introductions and essays. And he goes on to talk about that we're in the middle of a civil war, which is testing the nation. And this is he's at a cemetery, right? So he's dedicating this new cemetery, and obviously a lot of people who are going to be buried there have already been killed or will be killed in the coming days of the Civil War. So it's a very brief speech. Also, is what's interesting. The guy who spoke before Lincoln supposedly talked for like an hour. He gets up and talks for like 2 minutes and sits down and be like, "What? What did he even say?" And then later, when it was printed in the papers, people realized it was a very brilliant speech. But anyway, he goes on to make an argument in this speech. And again, if you want to look at this, you can read it. You might have seen it before. Maybe you had to see it in a history class or something. But he makes the argument for why it's important that the Union is preserved. In other words, that the country remains one country rather than being divided into two countries. And he does that in a really, with a lot of powerful language. And I would say very effective language. Not only me, lots of people have said that before. And so it's a great example of rhetoric. I won't go again. If you want to read it, you can, but it's fairly brief. And again, there's also a recording on this slide, 2 slides back, if you want to look at that when you have a chance. But I'm trying to keep these videos fairly brief, so I'm going to keep moving along and talk about one more thing from those same steps that you saw me standing at. Now, that's not where Lincoln delivered the speech. He was at the Gettysburg Cemetery, I believe. But the speech is printed on the wall next to his memorial there. But another very famous speech, nearly 100 years later, about 100 years later, August 28, 1963, not 1863, we had Martin Luther King Jr. delivering a speech there, which became kind of called the I Have a Dream speech, has that famous lines about I have a dream, right? About a more equal and just world. Same thing we could look at with Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. He has an opportunity, and we know the opportunity, the challenge, the problem, whatever we're going to call it, is civil rights and equal rights for African Americans in particular, but others as well. But that was his focus, I think. And then the writer, we know a little bit about him, so we could learn more about that. The audience, so you have to think he was speaking to a large group of people on what they call the National Mall there between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Memorial right there in Washington, D.C. And but he was also speaking to a much wider audience, radio, television, newspaper reporters. This was going to be broadcast all over the world. So in essence, he was speaking to a good part of the United States, but a good part of the world as well. So he had a large audience, and he really had to think about that. How could he possibly know what everybody thought? And he couldn't, right? So you have to just do your best to kind of assume, and you also have to choose sometimes, who am I actually speaking to? So the audience, a very important part of this I Have a Dream, is again this speech that was delivered advocating for civil and economic rights and to end racism in the United States. So this is a quote, this is the famous quote, right? I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's one of probably the most famous quotes of any contemporary user of language or rhetoric. What we talked about rhetoric is using language effectively, and that's why I chose these 2 speeches. And again, the purpose, I don't think he was trying to entertain. He was probably most likely explaining and informing and arguing, more importantly, arguing for change. He had a message, and he supported that with lots of examples, lots of effective use of language, and obviously had a stance where he believes that it's best not only for him individually, but for the whole country if everybody has equality. And he also says it's part of a promise, that there was this promise of equality that's sort of not been delivered on. And then finally, the context. He was in a very turbulent time in American history, delivering the speech in the early mid-60s, and it only got more turbulent over the next few years with the civil rights movement and all kinds of protests related to the Vietnam War and different things like that. So it's a very turbulent context, and knowing that helps you know more about. If you wanted to see this speech, you can also, I put links here, but you could very easily just Google I Have a Dream Martin Luther King, and in YouTube, and it will come up if you want to see the speech. It's a very powerful speech if you can, especially just not read it, but watch him delivering the speech. But, just like we talked about, just trying to emphasize this whole thing as you're writing, thinking about you as the author, what's your text, just like Martin Luther King Jr. had the speech that he had written and delivered, you'll have an essay. But it's the same, principle, basically. We always have an author, a text, some kind of purpose. There's a setting, or we could call it context, right? His was the 1960s civil rights movement, Washington, D.C., speaking to the world, basically, through all these microphones and cameras and things, and then the audience. And if you only think about just your audience and your purpose, that's a lot. If you do that effectively, that can really help your writing. And that's, again, what we call the rhetorical situation. I am going to go ahead and talk briefly about what's called essay structure. This is, if you have the Hard Brace book already, this is, again, our textbook for the class. If you have it, it's pages 8, 11, and then pages 25 and 29. There are many, many, many ways to write essays. I'm just going to share with you kind of what I call a fallback structure, or, it's like something just to have in your toolbox if you don't. Most people probably do, but if you don't, this is just a good thing to have. And we'll talk about it throughout the semester, but I'm not saying that this is the only way to write an essay, but it's just a good method. Everything has a beginning and a middle and an ending, right? Like a lifespan or whatever it is, right? And so essays are no different. We can call it introduction, body, and conclusion, but it just really means beginning, middle, and ending, just another way of thinking about it. But each one of those parts has, different roles, different functions, right? Just like every part of someone's body has a different function or role to play, right? And so first thing you want to do with your introduction, that would be the first paragraph usually of an essay. It could be more than one paragraph, but I would say a good paragraph. One paragraph is not a bad way to do an introduction. And it's engaging. So in other words, it's getting attention. How do you do that? Well, some people would say, oh, I ask a question. I provide a shocking or informative statistic. 77% of people who read this essay, no, it's got to be a real statistic. Don't make it up. And or relevant quotation, some famous quote. So over here in 2016, 68% of Americans owned at least one pet. So maybe I'm writing an essay about how to or what about pet ownership in America, right? And why it's so important to so many people. That could be a good way to start out. Is your pet an important part of your life? So that's right, asking a question. That could be a good question. And then you could go on to explain, I'm going to write in this essay about why pets are such an important part of people's daily life. Aldous Huxley, famous English writer, once said to his dog, every man is Napoleon. So I kind of feel that way about my dog sometimes, because I feed him and take care of him. He thinks I'm so great, right? So that's a good kind of humorous almost quote, right? If you think about it. And that could be a way to introduce an essay. So these are just 3 ways you could introduce an essay, but many, many ideas, and be as creative as you want to. But if you're having trouble getting started, I'm always going to share techniques with you. You can kind of fall back on those if you're kind of can't think of a way to get started. Use a question, use a statistic, use a quotation, and those will be good ways to incorporate those into that first paragraph. In that first paragraph also, you want to have what's called a thesis statement. Now, the way I always think of a thesis statement, the textbook will tell us a thesis statement is an explicit declaration of the overarching idea of your paper. That's true. I make it a little simpler than that, and I just say it's your subject plus your opinion. And if you can put that near the end of your intro paragraph, that's a great way to just set up. So maybe you had a statistic or a story, or you did something, got the reader's attention, and then you state your thesis statement. One sentence that says, I believe all Americans should have access to prenatal care, all expecting mothers. We're going to talk about that later in the semester. But, or I believe that we should be responsible to our friends and neighbors whenever they're in trouble, whatever it might be, right? You have an opinion, right? So subject plus opinion, that's your thesis statement. That should be, for me, in this kind of essay that we're talking about, in that introductory paragraph. All right, one other thing about a thesis statement, we're mostly doing persuasive or argumentative writing this semester. We're also doing summary writing and some other things, but primarily we're doing writing where you have to state what's called a debatable thesis. So debatable basically just means two reasonable people could disagree about it. When I say 2 reasonable people could disagree, I say that because it's hard sometimes to, like, let's just say I looked out the window and I said, the sun's out right now, it's very nice. And I say, oh, it's very cloudy. And the person looks at me and they're, oh, wait a minute, it's sunny. I mean, really, if we're both reasonable, we can look and see it's sunny, it's not cloudy. It's not raining, it's not snowing at least, right? If they say it's snowing and I disagree with them, well, they're being unreasonable. So it shouldn't be like a fact, right? So let's look at these for just to make sure everybody's kind of getting this idea with your thesis being debatable. Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. were both assassinated. That's true. That's a fact. So no, this is not a good thesis. If you write an essay that says Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, that's going to be a very short essay because I mean, it's just the truth. It's just a fact, right? I know these days we have alternative realities and everything. But in this reality, Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. were assassinated. So it's not a good thesis. So scratch that one off. More than anyone before or since, Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Lincoln moved the U.S. toward racial equality. So the idea that both of these men had huge impacts on moving forward, the U.S. moving forward toward a more just society is, I believe it, and maybe many of you watching the video believe it, but is it debatable? Yeah, I think it could be debatable because somebody might say, no, I think or I think, I don't know, maybe Maya Angelou, who's a very powerful writer, she had a lot of things to say about this topic and she influenced a lot of people. So there's lots of ways you could look at this. You could say, oh, there's some people who we don't even know their names. And they had this huge influence by doing X, Y, and Z. So I can't think of great examples right now, but I'm just saying this is debatable because it is possible to argue that there was somebody else who maybe moved us forward more. So again, you may agree with it, and that's fine. I agree with it. I wrote it, but it's but it could be debated, right? Lin-Manuel Miranda won 4 Tony Awards for his musical Hamilton. Again, think about it. If you want to pause this and just look at all these and quiz yourself, sort of choose yes, debatable, no, debatable, as you go through, you could do that. But number 3, I will say no, it's not debatable because we can just go Google how many Tony Awards did he win for Hamilton? Oh, 4. Wow. And if it's true, then it's just not debatable, right? So not a good one. Number 4, Lin-Manuel Miranda is a great role model for young people. Yes, debatable. Again, we may all agree with this. If you know anything about his life, I think definitely that's why I wrote it. It's true, in my opinion. But somebody else could say, no, I don't think so. I don't think musicians should be role models for people or composers or whatever. I don't like his politics. I don't like Hamilton. What you could say anything, right? So this could be debatable, I think. And so number 4 is a good yes. Number 3 is a no. It's not debatable. There's nothing to argue about. Though Spider-Man No Way Home is entertaining, revealing the identity of Peter Parker was a bad idea. So they tell us, I think in Spider-Man No Way Home, who Peter Parker is, and I think that's a bad idea. And so nobody cares what I think, but in Hollywood, I mean, hopefully you guys do a little bit. But yeah, so that's debatable, right? So number 5 is yes. The budget for the new Spider-Man movie was $200 million. No, that's not a good debatable thesis. So hopefully everybody got the idea. Just wanted to give a few examples. When you're writing your first essay, try to make sure you do have a debatable thesis and try to state that early on in the essay, if possible, near the end of the introduction paragraph. The body is going to have at least 3 points you're making, hopefully, to support your thesis statement. And this is, again, I'm looking at a format, what's called a 5-paragraph essay, where you have an intro paragraph, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. You can definitely mix that up as we go through the semester. Certainly, you can have more than 3 paragraphs in the body. Again, this is just a format that I like to share at the beginning of the semester. Hopefully, you master this and then break away from it. That's kind of my hope for this. That's what I'd like to see. Or you've already mastered this. You've done this many times probably. Use transitional words to make your ideas coherent. So transitional words are just those words like in the first place, after that, most importantly. These are words that help. They're kind of like signposts. And you really want to use those, especially in the body, if nothing else, at the beginning of each body paragraph. Like the most important point I want to make, and then you go on and do it. And then you say, also important, so you kind of use these signposts. We'll talk more about transitions as we go through the semester, but they're really important in the body. And finally, the conclusion, speaking of Hamilton, the conclusion from your essay, there's different ways you can do it. These are just 3 possibilities for that last paragraph. You could explain the significance of your main point. In other words, why did I even write about this topic? Why is this important? Maybe it didn't come across completely clearly, and you can kind of bring that all together for the reader at the end. You can explain the consequences. So I've told everybody that we should stop using fossil fuels, and I think we should move as quickly as possible to green technology. And here's what's going to happen if we don't. We're going to see more wildfires. We're going to see more heat waves. We're going to see more flooding, more coastal, all this stuff, right? And so you'd be explaining possible consequences of maybe not agreeing with you, or maybe some positive consequences of agreeing with you. And then finally, you could just make a final point. There's one thing I wanted to say in the body, I didn't get to do it, so I just make a paragraph at the end and include it. These are just 3 possible conclusions. We'll talk more about introductions and conclusions as we go on to the first few weeks, but just wanted to share a couple of possibilities as you sort of get started with essay number 1 this first week. So that is all I have for the rhetoric part. Please, as always, send me an email if you have any questions, or if that went too fast, you can always go back and watch it, but I will, again, try to keep the videos brief. And again, if you have questions, send me an email, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.